Welcome to the latest edition of At the Table, just a few weeks before the presidential election. Joining me today is Sarah McCammon, the National Public Radio, national political correspondent, and co-host of their Politics podcast. Sarah's work covers the political, social, and cultural divides in America, including abortion policy and the intersection of politics and religion. Sarah is also a former Sun-Times intern for me, whose moxie and maturity and smarts just knocked me off my feet when I met her years and years ago. Sarah now is the author of a new book, Exvangelicals, Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church, a book that's part memoir and part journalism about the movement of people who grew up inside the powerful evangelical subculture and ultimately left in response to its increasing polarization. So, Sarah, really great to have you join me in this important political season that we're in, and also in this book that you wrote that is very much part of your own story. So, Sarah, when we met, I was just meeting you when you were a student at Trinity Evangelical University in Deerfield, Illinois, or Bannockburn, depending on the postal code you use. And,
the Chicago suburbs, yes.
Right. But what really did impress me at the time is you just kind of showed up and you were nobody from nowhere, but you figured out how to be a Senate page, and then you figured out how to find your way to me. And I never took interns, but I took you. And then that led you to a career at the Daily Herald. And then you went on to local and national public radio. And I remember in 2016, Trump's running, and you got assigned to cover Trump. My sense was partly because of all the evangelical support he was given. So let me toss this to you and tell me how this assignment covering Trump might have influenced your writing of the book and just your own journey.
Well, first of all, thank you, because for those who don't know, I still am kind of nobody from nowhere, but Lynn Sweet was a really important person in my journey into journalism. So I'm grateful for that. And I'm glad we're still in touch and that we can talk about this book. And, I think you're partly right about that. What I was told when I was recruited to NPR to cover the 2016 campaign, and I should say this was before Trump even announced that I was in the process of being considered for that job in early 2015. It wasn't necessarily because of my evangelical background, which I really kind of tried to stay away from. I didn't like to lead with that for a bunch of reasons. I think it was more because I was somebody who had been working I've been covering politics from kind of way outside the Beltway. I was in Nebraska, then Iowa, then Georgia. And I think my understanding was that there was a desire to bring in some people who had kind of that outside the Beltway sensibility, which, as you know, being from the Midwest, is sometimes a little different than what people are thinking and talking about in Washington. And so I was really grateful to have that opportunity. And then I was really kind of amazed at how important that became. The ways that by the time I came to NPR just weeks after Trump had announced. And as you well remember, that 2016 Republican field was a huge field. I, like a lot of political reporters, was bouncing around covering a lot of different candidates, but mostly focusing on Republicans. That was what I was assigned to. And, we all remember Trump was at the top of the polls most of the time. And a lot of the pundits said he was going to sort of fall away. And eventually voters would coalesce around somebody else. And that never happened. And white evangelicals, who make up such an important part of the Republican base, became a really important part of the story, which for me was fascinating and sometimes a little bit uncomfortable because I had my own history, some space from it, but my own history with that world.
So could you summarize for our audience here what that world was growing up in Kansas? Or what, let me read a portion from your book here on it. You were growing up in let me talk about, you were growing up when you had an epiphany. You had a sense that you'd often babysit with your 3 siblings while your parents were out for a date. you had gone to Christian schools, you were going by the book, and then you learned your grandfather was a homosexual and it was a secret within the family. And then you had titled this chapter, Whom Does Jesus Love? As you were trying to figure out and dealing with your mother and your parents in figuring out what this meant to your life and to your beliefs, you said, you eventually got to know your grandfather, and you said, I'm grateful that my own change of heart came before it was too late to know my grandfather. By my early 20s, as I've learned about the Bible and church history, as I studied them in college, it was becoming more difficult to defend biblical literalism. And kind of, could you wind that into your own journey here, into your own beliefs growing up, and how this might have given you insights, especially in covering what what you have come to cover?
Right. So, I did very much grow up in what a lot of people, a lot of my peers and I would call kind of the evangelical bubble, the evangelical subculture. And this was the 80s and 90s. So this was a time when, the country was starting to become increasingly diverse and secular. But in my world, it was a white evangelical world. Almost everybody I knew believed the same things. And, the line between evangelicalism and Christian fundamentalism is one that scholars and pollsters and historians and sociologists like to debate. But for me, there was a pretty permeable line there. I mean, we believed in, real biblical literalism, young earth creationism. I was taught that in my Christian school. Everybody in my world saw the world in kind of a similar way. And that way did not include room for LGBTQ people. And as you mentioned, one of the, I think, really crucial relationships in my life, and one of the really central characters in my book, is my grandfather, who came out as gay, in his 60s in the 1980s. This is a tumultuous time politically, and certainly when it came to gay rights. With a evangelical fundamentalist son, and at a time when he was already 60 years old and was kind of finally becoming more open about who he was. And so that relationship for me, in a lot of ways, both because of his sexuality and because of his beliefs, he didn't believe what we believed, really forced me to kind of reckon with how I was being taught to see the world, and also to reckon with the reality of different perspectives. And the title of that chapter, Who Does Jesus Love, is a sort of an homage to my friend Jeff Chu, who I also interview in the book, who wrote a book called Does Jesus Really Love Me?, which was about his own experience growing up in the evangelical world and coming to terms with his sexuality. And Jeff is an ordained minister now, and somebody who's really had to contend with coming from a world and a family that has struggled to accept him for who he is as a gay man. And so that experience in those relationships, I think, sort of created a foil, my grandfather in particular, a foil for what I was being told about the world. And as I think it's in many ways part of what drove me to become a journalist. I mean, I wouldn't have said so or really articulated it at the time, but my whole childhood was kind of surrounded by these questions and these tensions around how do you make sense of reality? What's true? What's real? And, one of the things I appreciate about my upbringing is a real focus on trying to understand what's good and how to live. And whether we got the answers right or not, I think the questions are important. And in some ways, journalism is sort of documenting how people grapple with those questions. And in a really diverse, pluralistic democracy, how do we contend with all of our differences and yet try to come together and make decisions collectively, as free Americans? And so I think there is a through line there for me between the things I was thinking about and concerned with as a child and the things I was drawn to as an adult in terms of our profession.
One of the things that you do talk about in your book are the dangers of Christian nationalism and mounting evidence that white evangelicals are susceptible to conspiracy theories. But before we dig into that in the context of the Kamala Harris, Donald Trump campaign, there's a new AP NORC, National Opinion Research Center, poll out this week that says white evangelical Protestants have a favorable view of Donald Trump, but few would describe him as Christian or moral. more than half say he better represents the religious views or beliefs than Harris. Now, we've been using the word white evangelical because there is a difference. The poll notes the contrast. About half of Black Protestants who have the most positive view of Harris consider her as moral, and 6 in 10 think she's the candidate that better represents their religious views or beliefs. So I guess what we have to dig into, and now if we can switch a bit to this political campaign that we're covering, there is then a divide that remains, is there not, between evangelicals in this case are not monolithic. Could you explain this a little bit?
Yeah. So the reason we talk about, there were some people, a couple of my events, and every now and then I'll get a question when I talk about my book, why did you put white in the subtitle? Why are you focusing on race? And I thought about whether or not to do that. My editor and I had a conversation about whether or not we should specifically mention race in the subtitle. And we felt ultimately that it was important because, as I think all of us who cover politics know, race is, not for each individual an absolute determiner or anything like that, but it is, in the aggregate, very determinative of how, or it indicates how people vote. There's a large correlation between race and voting habits. And if you look specifically at Christians, and you want to look specifically at Protestant Christians, so people who have, on paper at least, very similar theologies, Black Christians and white Christians, and there are many other types of Christians, many other races and ethnicities, but I'm just sort of talking about those two groups right now for simplicity's sake. Black Christians and white Christians with similar theological beliefs vote really, really differently. So white evangelical Protestants with a conservative theology overwhelmingly vote for Republicans. About 8 in 10 white evangelicals voted for Trump in the last 2 elections. They were instrumental in making Trump the nominee again in 2024. Black Protestants overwhelmingly vote for Democrats, again, in the aggregate. And if you look at, say, Latino Christians, it's somewhere in the middle. And that's a group that's, I think, a little bit more of a swing voter group than Black or white evangelicals. But you can't talk about voting habits and how in religion and politics without talking about race. So I felt that was really important. Now, when it comes to how voters view the religiosity of candidates, what's pretty clear, and what this latest poll you mentioned just seems to confirm again, is that, despite all the questions around why do white evangelicals support Trump? Isn't he at odds with their belief system? Well, many of them will admit that he is, acknowledge that he doesn't embody, the character they want their kids to exhibit. I've had lots of conversations with voters like this over the years, and I will very often hear, and you've probably heard this too, hear people say, I wish he wouldn't tweet so much. I wish he would watch his mouth a little bit. I don't always like what he says, but, and then there's the but, which is, but I'm not going to vote for a Democrat because they're pro-choice, or I'm not going to, vote for somebody who doesn't believe in religious freedom. And so there are these ideas about Democrats that many conservative white Christians have absorbed. And there's a sense that Trump is sort of a champion of their ideological and political goals, which are often infused with their theological beliefs about the family, sort of a patriarchal, traditional gender roles dynamic for the family, a real emphasis on marriage, on, heterosexual relationships being the norm. And they see the Republican Party and Trump as someone who will sort of advance those ideas. And they don't care that much, I don't think, whether or not Trump himself is a devout person. I mean, there have been attempts over the years. I think there was a quote attributed to James Dobson at one point in the 2016 cycle, who said that, maybe Trump is a newer Christian. He's still kind of learning. But overall, I think much more often I've heard evangelicals acknowledge that Trump doesn't embody their beliefs, but that he sort of serves their political goals. And they'll point out, in an election, it's essentially a binary choice. There are 2 people that are likely to win. You have to pick one of them. People will say, I know there was a poll a couple years ago from, I think it was Pew, that also found that I think less than 10% of white evangelical Christians said they thought that Trump was, strongly religious. So that's not fundamentally what it is about.
You're right. Okay, so in 2016, maybe you could cut people a break. They weren't sure. The twice divorced, womanizing Trump, what it would take. So now we have the election 2020 and 2024. And this, the white evangelical base is still sticking with him. And you talk about this, I think the poll that you referred to just now, the 2021 survey from Pew, that in the end, you write, their own movement was redefined as a reactionary, angry, white Christian storm the Capitol movement. You're quoting someone else's here analysis, people who don't have any idea about classic evangelical doctrines, but by God, they like Trump and they're white, so therefore they're evangelical. So given that there were choices earlier on in the primary season, it seems that what has come out so clearly is the link, as you write, between evangelicalism and the far right. It seems, in my analysis, it's a little different in the context of 2024 than in 2016 because we've had this emergence of a far right, election denialism, conspiracy theories, and what we've seen in recent weeks in the inflammatory rhetoric of Trump, which we'll get to in detail, but I think so our listeners know we're talking about false claims about people eating pets in Springfield, and et cetera. What do you make of this? How do you analyze it, Sarah?
I think there are a couple of explanations for it. One is similar to the answer for 2016 and 2020. Again, this idea that many voters feel they have essentially two choices and they need to pick the one that is most likely to advance their political goals. Another line we've heard more than once from people like, I think, Tony Perkins of the Family Research Council, I believe, said this, and I've heard it from lesser known evangelicals as well. The idea that they're picking, they're not picking a pastor, they're picking a president. So that's one piece of it. Again, it's seen as a binary choice. You have to make a choice. Now, you're right that in the primary in 2024, there were many choices. So it wasn't as if Trump was the only choice for people who wanted to choose a conservative Republican candidate. But I think there, again, basically two things going on. One is just the power of, in this case, not somebody who they saw as promising to advance their ideological goals, but somebody who actually had done so. I mean, Trump ran in 2016 on this promise, on many promises, but one of the big ones was to try to overturn Roe v. Wade. And he did it. I mean, he's bragged about doing so to evangelical audiences. He is largely responsible for the overturning of Roe v. Wade through the selection of those three conservative justices. Without Trump, it wouldn't have happened. And that is both something, a talking point for him when he speaks to his base and a liability for him when he's trying to reach central, sort of more centrist swing voters. But his base knows that he did that and is happy about it and wants to do more. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is just the power of incumbency. I mean, even in the 2024 primary, as you know, it's so hard to overcome, for anybody to overcome the power of an incumbent. And Trump, while technically not an incumbent at that time, was kind of functionally an incumbent, so well known, and represented not necessarily a majority of the Republican Party, but a giant lane of the Republican Party that he had kind of created and expanded over the years. And so, that's my analysis, that it was partly a gratitude for what he'd already done and a desire for him to do more of it. And just, it's just hard to overpower the juggernaut that is Trump.
So what role do you see abortion playing right now? Because when we have this election, it's up to just a sliver of voters in a handful of swing states. And Trump won't say, neither will Senator Vance, they would sign a federal abortion ban, and also said that women are grateful for women writ large, as if we all speak in one voice on what he's done. How do you think this plays into the evangelical base? What do you think is the message that he's sending, where maybe he's trying to be a little fence-sitting here?
Well, some evangelicals aren't thrilled with his mixed messaging recently on this issue, because, again, he clearly recognizes the political liability of the abortion issue. Polls indicate that most voters actually didn't want Roe v. Wade to be overturned. Most voters support at least some access to abortion. There's pretty overwhelming support for access. Now, most voters also want some limitations, some restrictions, but under the Roe framework, that was possible. States could actually regulate during the third trimester, could regulate abortion pretty significantly, and to a large degree during the second trimester as well, with more limitations, less so during the first. Roe had this 3 trimester framework, and that was pretty in line with what voters wanted. So doing away with it means that now we are seeing many stories of women being turned away for emergency abortion care in states where abortion is illegal. We're seeing stories of there's a high profile young woman who's from Kentucky who has told her story about being a victim of rape and incest. She didn't have an abortion, but she's a sort of person who, had she been in a slightly different situation, had she not miscarried, probably would have been seeking one. And she speaks from a personal perspective about what that experience was like. And so voters are hearing these stories. And I think many voters, including many Republican voters, or certainly swing voters, are going, wait a second, maybe this has gone a bit too far. And we know that from polling. And we also know that from the last 2 years, every election that's been held since the Dobbs decision, in which voters had an opportunity to vote for an abortion-related ballot initiative. They have indicated support for abortion rights. So Republicans know that, Trump knows that, and I think we've seen him, capitulating a little bit on his messaging. And so evangelicals aren't thrilled with that. Southern Baptist Convention's Al Mohler said that Trump is risking, alienating his base. I'm paraphrasing, but it was something to that effect. Former Vice President Mike Pence, who of course has said he isn't supporting Trump. He's not necessarily supporting Harris, but he said he's not supporting Trump this time around. He's specifically raised concerns about Trump's messaging on abortion. The issue, though, is that this is a base issue. So it's not as if these voters are going to go vote for Vice President Harris because they're upset with Trump for softening or trying to soften his message on abortion. It's more of a concern for Trump that, perhaps some of his voters might not be as motivated to show up. And that's always been one of Trump's strengths, is being able to turn out his base. But I think it's really going to matter in the places that everything else matters, right? The 7 swing states that everybody's talking about. One of those, Arizona, has an abortion-related ballot initiative on the ballot this fall. It'll be really interesting to see how that affects who turns out and how people vote. And, Democrats just also fully understand the lay of the land when it comes to the abortion issue. So they've been hitting this issue really hard. Vice President Harris just last week gave a speech in Georgia talking about a woman there who had died after the Dobbs decision took effect, and after she was denied a DNC, first denied an abortion in Georgia and then denied a DNC when she had a complication from an abortion pill. So I would expect to hear a lot more of this in the next few weeks, because this is kind of, potentially the number one issue that helps Democrats, and they fully understand that.
So how does IVF fit into this? Because Trump now has ping-ponged on this issue, which certainly, again, if you're talking about turning out a female vote, I have seen some data that suggests this is treated differently than pure abortion rights, because so many people don't view this in the same way when you use fertilization to have a baby. How do you think this will play? And is Trump clearly seems to have struggled on this.
IVF has turned out to be another authority issue for Republicans for a couple of reasons. First of all, I just said that abortion access, especially early in pregnancy and in situations of rape, incest, medical complications, it's very popular in all of those situations, and then some. IVF is even more popular. A majority of Republicans support access to IVF. The problem is that for people who are in the anti-abortion movement, who are deeply committed to the idea that life begins at conception, that a fertilized embryo has the same moral status as a human being, which many in that movement believe, often for religious reasons, although many would say it's not only a religious belief, but I'll leave that to another conversation. But that's, that's a fundamental belief of many people, many, especially Christians, including Catholics and evangelicals who oppose abortion. They believe that really that God creates a person at that moment of conception, and that to interrupt that development process is tantamount to taking a human life. And so if you believe that, and you understand that the IVF process, which basically artificially inseminates and creates embryos for couples that for whatever reason are unable to create them the traditional way, that process often results in leftover embryos. A couple has 2 or 3 children and they're done, and they have extra embryos that they don't need, and those have to be discarded or perhaps donated to another couple, or frozen. And the idea of freezing or discarding an embryo that many anti-abortion activists see as a human life is very disturbing to them. So these slogans that the anti-abortion movement has used for decades of life begins at conception, abortion is murder. When it comes to IVF, which again is very popular because women are delaying having children in greater numbers. It's harder to get pregnant the older you get. We all know this. And so IVF is very popular. It's used by many couples, including Christian couples. And so this creates sort of a logical problem and a political bind for many Republicans who've been committed to some of these ideas, which would seem, if applied to IVF, to complicate or problematize IVF. And so we've seen, I think that's why we've seen some of the messaging from Trump on this. He and JD Vance have both tried to reassure voters that, IVF isn't going away, even to the point of Trump saying he would support a government mandate that insurance companies cover IVF or the government paying for it, both of which are policies that are incredibly out of line with longstanding Republican principles, both fiscally conservative principles and if you think back to the Obamacare fight around the birth control mandate, which required very similar idea, required insurance companies in most cases to cover contraception. There was a big fight over that, legal battles over that, with opposition from many socially conservative, religious conservative groups. So again, I think it just indicates the political difficulties that Republicans are experiencing around IVF. And this, of course, all came to light a few months ago when the Alabama Supreme Court issued a ruling that essentially gave embryos the same legal rights as children, which then led to IVF clinics temporarily shutting down, Republican state lawmakers and the governor rushing to pass a legislative fix. And, unfortunately for Republicans, it really spotlighted this kind of conundrum they're in with the issue of IVF.
Right. And in the Senate, Senate Republicans have declined to back, and this was a very big issue for Illinois Senator Tammy Duckworth, whose 2 daughters were conceived in IVF. This is now one of her crusades to try to find some way of locking into federal law a right to access to IVF. And yet there's no movement from Republican senators. We don't have a lot of time left. I'm wondering, in your analysis of what the influence of white evangelicalism now is on the status of the campaign. Is this, there are so, in a close vote, it seems every special interest group, Sarah, can tip it. Every day there's a story. The importance of the Black vote, the Hispanic vote, the youth vote, as if all these votes are monolithic, the Jewish vote, now the white evangelical vote, the Southern vote. Where and what within the forces at work here do you see the clout or power of this vote in 2024?
Well, the white evangelical share of the population is shrinking. The white Christian share of the population overall is shrinking. It's not just white evangelicals, but white evangelicals are a unique group in that they have been a very large group. They used to make up, as recently as 20 years ago, almost 1 in 4 Americans was a white evangelical, which I know is shocking to a lot of people on the coast, but it's true. And that number is down to around 13% now, according to the Public Religion Research Institute. But white evangelicals vote in disproportionate numbers. They're very committed. They're very engaged. And more than any other religious group, I think, they're more in lockstep with a single party than almost any other group, and certainly any group of their size. So if you look at white Catholics or white mainline Protestants, like Episcopalians, Lutherans, Methodists, those groups are also these white Christian groups tilt toward Republicans, but not nearly as far as white evangelicals. So that is a group that the Republican Party knows they need to mobilize, and they put a lot of resources, and their supporters a lot of resources into mobilizing those voters through ad campaigns, through voter leaflets in churches, distributed in churches, which, as long as they're worded in a certain way, arguably don't violate election laws, as long as they're worded in a certain way. But there's just a huge, and I think every 4 years, every 2 years, maybe even stronger machine to turn out those voters. Even though they're a shrinking share of the population, they're still a significant one. If you consider that Black Americans are about 13% of the population, so are white evangelicals, right? And so they're not exactly symmetrical groups, but significant groups, and they're targeted by the campaigns for a reason, because they know how those groups tend to vote. So they continue to play a role. As the numbers shrink, as the demographics of the country change, I think white evangelicals will eventually become less influential, but I don't think we're quite there yet. And, the other thing I'll mention that I'm fascinated by is that the biggest growth in religion is people who have no religion at all in this country, religious nuns, NES. That group, if you survey them, is about 70% Democratic, but they're not nearly as civically engaged or politically engaged as, say, white evangelicals. And so while the demographics of the country and the sort of, I think, opinions of voters may be moving, to the left historically of where the country has been, that doesn't necessarily translate into political change as long as Republicans successfully mobilize the Christian right, and the Christian right stays continues to overwhelmingly support Republican candidates. So it remains an important group to watch.
So, and then this briefly, because we are winding down, and I want to end this show with getting back to your own story here. Very briefly, a very constant theme that Trump talks about is Israel. He's a better friend of Israel, and the Jew who doesn't vote for him is basically a Jew to be blamed for not Israel, whatever. My long analysis has been that this is really aimed more at trying to stimulate a white evangelical vote than a Jewish vote. Though in recent days, I'm kind of revising it to think he's also trying to suppress the Jewish vote because of the very harsh things he's saying about Jews not to be blamed for things. Does this rhetoric on Israel, do you think it will help stimulate his evangelical turnout?
I do. I was at the Israeli American Council Summit in DC the other night, where Trump made some of those statements, sort of preemptively blaming Jewish voters if he loses, he repeated some of the kinds of statements he's made over the years, arguing that Jewish Democrats, which of course are the majority of American Jews, are somehow disloyal to Israel if they vote for Democrats. And he said a number of other things that were pretty broadly criticized by Jewish groups across the spectrum as anti-Semitic. And inappropriate. But he said these kinds of things before. And I do think that he understands that his messaging on Israel is exciting to his base. I think you're right that it may also be about suppressing the Jewish vote to some extent. But of course, that's a relatively small number of voters compared to evangelical voters. And so I think those are, in his mind, likely the real prize. He told a story at that event about being in Iowa in 2015 with a group of, he said, very Christian voters, pretty clearly evangelical voters. And he said he was surprised when his host told him to say nice things about Israel. It was almost as if he didn't quite realize the politics of Israel with evangelicals. And he said, my, how things have changed. And he said the crowd went wild and loved him for saying those things. So I think you're right. I think it's somewhat aimed at Jewish voters, but just as much, if not more, aimed at evangelical Christians.
So back to you and your life. You married your Trinity classmate. You had 2 boys, went on to NPR, but you ended up getting divorced and you married Greg, who's Jewish.
I did.
You write in your book, Grandpa hasn't changed, but I had. So we only have a minute or 2 left. Can you kind of give us a summary, your life, and how you changed, and how, where you started and where you're at now, and just what your parting thought is that you want to leave?
In 30 seconds, sure. No, you're quoting from the end of the book where I am saying goodbye to my grandfather, who again was such a central character in my life and in the book, as he's passing. And I'm so grateful that I had many, many years with him. He lived a very long, wonderful life. And so I had an opportunity to get to know him as an adult, as I myself was evolving. And yes, my life has played out in probably certainly ways I wouldn't have expected or planned, but beautifully, I did not stay married to my Christian college sweetheart, but we have two beautiful kids together. We co-parent together, and I am remarried to someone of another faith, of the Jewish faith, and that has been really wonderful for me to sort of. I think being in an interfaith relationship, anybody who's in an interfaith relationship can probably understand it. Sometimes it challenges you to think differently, and it also can help you grow and learn new things and see things just from a different perspective. So I've been really grateful for that. And I've been at NPR now for over 9 years. It'll be 10 next year, which is kind of crazy to think about. But I never saw myself covering white evangelicals in this way. It just kind of happened, kind of fell into my lap because of the timing of when I became a national political correspondent. But I have found the background, that I bring to the world and to my work to be, at times really helpful to sort of try to understand where we are politically and how we got here, because I do have such deep history with that world. I sort of speak the language. I understand the theology and the philosophy and the thinking. And I'm probably as fascinated as anybody else, both as a journalist and just a human being, to see where this all goes next.
Well, certainly. You've put a lot on our At the Table today. Thank you, Sarah McCammon, for joining us. She is the author of the new book, The Exvangelicals, Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. Sarah, great to see you. Everyone, see you at the next At the Table.
Thank you.